In the quiet cobblestone streets of Salem, Massachusetts, a town steeped in history and shadowed by its past, an unassuming antique shop held a secret waiting to be unearthed. It was a place where forgotten relics whispered tales of bygone eras, and amidst the dust and the scent of aged wood, a local history enthusiast named David stumbled upon a find that would unravel a chilling narrative. The shop, a cozy labyrinth of curiosities, was owned by an older woman named Martha, whose eyes held the wisdom of countless stories, though she rarely shared them. David, a man with an insatiable appetite for local lore, was sifting through a stack of old photographs, each one a tiny window into another time. His fingers brushed against a small, faded tintype, its surface bearing the subtle sheen of a forgotten art. He pulled it out, his interest piqued. The image depicted two young men, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, standing side by side. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind one might see in portraits from the late 1800s. Their faces, though softened by the passage of time and the tintype's unique aesthetic, bore a striking resemblance to each other, so much so that they appeared almost identical. "Just a common tintype, dear," Martha remarked, her voice a gentle rustle. "Probably brothers, from around the turn of the century. We get a lot of those. Folks liked to commemorate family back then." She offered a small, knowing smile, accustomed to the romantic notions her customers often attached to such mundane items. David nodded, accepting her assessment. He saw what Martha saw, a simple, poignant snapshot of two siblings, forever frozen in time, their youthful visages hinting at lives lived and stories untold. He imagined them growing up in some quaint New England home, sharing childhood secrets and dreams. It was a nice piece of local history, he thought, a tangible link to Salem's rich tapestry of past inhabitants. He paid Martha a modest sum, the tintype nestled carefully in his palm, and left the shop, a pleasant sense of discovery accompanying him through the historic streets. Back home, settled in his study, David felt a familiar urge to share his find. He was an active member of a local history forum, a bustling online community where enthusiasts exchanged discoveries, theories, and fragments of Salem's past. He carefully scanned the tintype, uploaded the image, and posted it with a simple query. "Found this old tintype today. Two brothers, I think. Does anyone recognize the family or the location? From the late 1800s, I'd guess." Almost immediately, comments began to trickle in. The initial responses were exactly as he expected, confirming his own interpretation. "Looks like brothers indeed," one user typed, "classic New England family portrait." Another added, "So typical of the era, they look like good honest folk." The general consensus echoed Martha's casual observation. Two brothers, a common tintype, a quaint glimpse into a simpler time. David felt a quiet satisfaction. His intuition had been confirmed, and his small piece of history was being appreciated. Then, a new comment appeared, interrupting the gentle flow of affirmation. It was from Dr. Evelyn Reed, a name David recognized instantly. Dr. Reed was a respected history professor at a local university, known for her sharp intellect and her specialized interest in local folklore and unexplained phenomena. Her online presence was usually reserved for academic discussions or insightful historical analyses. Her comment was brief, almost terse, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Interesting, look closely at their hands." David paused, a faint ripple of curiosity turning into something more. Why the emphasis on their hands? He scrolled back to his uploaded image, then zoomed in, focusing on the details Dr. Reed had highlighted. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. First, he examined the hand of the man on the left. It was perfectly normal. A typical human hand, fingers relaxed, resting casually by his side. Nothing unusual there. Then, his gaze shifted to the hand of the man on the right. A sudden, sharp intake of breath escaped David's lips. The initial feeling of pleasant discovery evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation that started at the base of his neck and spread rapidly. The hand, belonging to the man who looked so strikingly similar to his supposed brother, was profoundly unnatural. It appeared elongated, almost stretched, the fingers disturbingly thin and bent at odd angles like gnarled branches. They seemed too long for a human hand, and the way they curved gave the unsettling impression of something almost claw-like. It was a detail that, once seen, could not be unseen. It stood in stark, grotesque contrast to the normal, relaxed hand of the other man. The pleasant narrative of two brothers, a simple family portrait shattered in an instant. This wasn't just a photo of two siblings. The chilling detail of that hand, so subtly horrifying, suggested something far more sinister, far more complex, lurking beneath the surface of what had seemed like an ordinary historical artifact. A cold dread settled deep within David, a premonition that this faded tintype held a story far darker than he could have ever imagined. Dr. Evelyn Reed's message had sent a shiver down David's spine, and it wasn't long before his phone buzzed again. A new email, this time directly from Dr. Reed herself, confirmed his growing unease. She expressed her profound intrigue with the photograph, her words carefully chosen but conveying a palpable excitement. Her specialization, she explained, wasn't just in local folklore, but specifically in the intersection of historical records and what she termed unexplained phenomena. Those whispers and shadows that often lingered at the edges of documented history. The unnatural hand detail, she elaborated, was not entirely new to her. She had encountered similar descriptions, albeit in extremely rare and obscure historical accounts connected to certain families within the region, families often associated with hushed rumors and peculiar idiosyncrasies. They quickly arranged to meet, their shared curiosity forging an immediate bond. David brought the tintype, now carefully protected, and Dr. Reed arrived with a stack of old texts and a keen analytical mind. As she examined the photograph under a magnifying glass, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't a deformity as we might commonly understand it, David," she murmured, her voice low. "It's too pronounced, too specific, and the other hand perfectly normal. This points to something far more intricate than a simple birth defect." Their initial plan was straightforward, to dig deeper into the origins of the photograph itself. The first step was to pinpoint its estimated era and, crucially, its exact location of creation. Dr. Reed, with her extensive knowledge of photographic history, quickly confirmed David's initial guess. The tintype's particular style, the clarity of the image despite its age, and the subtle chemical signatures visible under specialized light all pointed to a specific photographic studio in Salem. This studio, she knew, had operated only between 1880 and 1895, a narrow 14-year window that significantly reduced their search parameters. Armed with this vital clue, their research shifted to the dusty archives of the Salem Historical Society. They spent days poring over brittle ledgers, faded appointment books, and meticulously kept client records from that specific studio. The records were often terse, sometimes illegible, but slowly, painstakingly, they began to piece together fragments of information. They cross-referenced dates, photographic styles, and even the type of paper used for receipts. The breakthrough came on a particularly humid afternoon. Deep within a forgotten box of miscellaneous papers, they found a booking entry for a Mr. Silas Thorne and Companion, dated precisely to the autumn of 1888. The entry was unusually brief. Most bookings listed full names of all sitters, or at least a family name for the companion. But here, only Companion was noted, a small yet significant omission that now, in light of the photograph, felt profoundly deliberate. The date, 1888, perfectly aligned with the estimated age of the subjects in the tintype, placing them squarely within the studio's operational period. The name Thorne immediately resonated with Dr. Reed. The Thorne family, she explained, was not just any family in Salem. They were an old, reclusive, and notoriously wealthy lineage, their roots deeply entwined with the town's earliest, darkest legends. Whispers about the Thornes had persisted for generations, often spoken in hushed tones, tales of their eccentricities, their isolation, and an unspoken unease that seemed to cling to their very name. They were known for their sprawling, secluded estate on the outskirts of town, a property that had stood empty and decaying for decades, a silent testament to a grandeur long faded. The discovery of the Thorne name opened a floodgate of research. David and Dr. Reed immersed themselves in old town records, probate documents, church registries, and even local newspaper archives from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The more they read, the more a disturbing pattern began to emerge. There were numerous mentions of an unusual affliction that seemed to run in the Thorne line, often described with vague but unsettling terminology. References to a physical peculiarity, a delicate constitution, or even a sensitivity to light appeared repeatedly, often associated with specific Thorne family members who lived particularly secluded lives. One particularly revealing entry in a town council meeting minute from 1892 discussed a petition from a neighboring farmer regarding unexplained livestock losses near the Thorne property, which was quickly dismissed as superstitious nonsense by the Thorne family's legal representatives. Another, from a social column in 1905, noted the absence of a certain Thorne family matriarch from all public gatherings, attributing it to her chronic and debilitating ailment, which necessitates her remaining indoors at all times. The most consistent and unsettling detail, however, revolved around the hands. Though never explicitly described in detail in public records, there were numerous anecdotal accounts, often from former servants or distant relatives, that spoke of certain Thorne family members consistently avoiding public touch, wearing gloves even indoors, or having an almost unnatural aversion to shaking hands. These were not just eccentricities, they were persistent, almost ritualistic behaviors that, when viewed through the lens of the tintype, began to paint a chilling picture. The unusual affliction wasn't just a vague genetic condition. It was a specific, physical manifestation, one that the Thorne family had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal for centuries. The photograph, once a mere curiosity, was rapidly transforming into a key, unlocking a deeply buried family secret, a secret far more disturbing than either David or Dr. Reed had initially dared to imagine. The cold dread David had felt earlier now resonated with Dr. Reed, a shared understanding that they were on the precipice of something truly dark. Armed with the escalating evidence and a growing sense of unease, David and Dr. Reed decided their next logical step was to visit the source itself, the old Thorne estate. It stood, as Dr. Reed had described, on the outskirts of Salem, a sprawling, dilapidated mansion that had long since surrendered to the relentless embrace of time and neglect. Getting permission wasn't as difficult as they anticipated. The current owner, a distant relative living hundreds of miles away, was largely uninterested in the property, viewing it as nothing more than a tax burden and an inherited headache. A few phone calls, some legal formalities, and a signed waiver later, they found themselves standing before the imposing wrought iron gates, rusted shut and overgrown with thorny vines. The air around the estate felt different, heavy and still, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. The once manicured gardens were now a wild tangle of weeds and untamed brush, trees casting long, skeletal shadows across the crumbling facade of the house. Ivy clawed its way up the stone walls, obscuring windows that stared out like vacant eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. As they pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned in protest on ancient hinges, a wave of cold, stagnant air washed over them. The interior was a cavernous expanse of shadows and dust motes, dancing in the slivers of light that pierced through grimy windows. The grandeur that must have once defined the Thorne residence was now just a ghostly echo. Cobwebs draped from chandeliers like tattered shrouds, and the intricate patterns of the wallpaper peeled and curled, revealing layers of faded elegance beneath. Every surface was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust, a testament to decades of abandonment. It was a house frozen in time, a mausoleum of forgotten lives, filled with the remnants of a life cut short or simply abandoned in haste. They moved methodically through the decaying rooms, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating forgotten furniture draped in white sheets, silent witnesses to untold histories. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the creak of floorboards underfoot and the rhythmic thumping of their own hearts. They searched for anything that might shed more light on the Thorne family, specifically on the two brothers in the photograph. Their search eventually led them to a less obvious part of the house, away from the main living areas. Behind a cleverly disguised bookshelf in what appeared to be a lesser-used parlor, David discovered a hidden door. It was almost perfectly camouflaged, a testament to the Thorne family's penchant for secrecy. With a grunt, he managed to pull it open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. This led to a small, secluded room, untouched for decades. This was clearly a study, but unlike the main library, it felt intensely personal, almost hermetically sealed from the rest of the house. The air here was even colder, carrying a faint, musty scent of old paper and something else, something indefinable that prickled at the back of their throats. Inside, amidst towering shelves filled with leather-bound tomes and scientific instruments that seemed out of place in a domestic setting, they found a cluttered desk. On it, beneath a layer of dust so thick it resembled felt, lay a series of leather-bound journals. Dr. Reed's eyes widened as she carefully picked one up. "Silas Thorne," she whispered, reading the faded inscription on the spine. It was a diary, belonging to the man with the normal hand in the photograph. The entries began innocently enough, dated from the late 1880s. Silas wrote in a meticulous, educated hand, detailing the mundane rhythms of daily life on the estate, observations about the weather, local gossip, and his studies. He spoke of his parents, their expectations, and his own quiet aspirations. But slowly, subtly, the tone of the diary began to shift, a darker narrative unfolding with each turning page. Silas wrote extensively about his twin brother Thomas. He described their shared childhood, their uncanny resemblance, and the dreams they had once shared. But then the entries took a somber turn. Thomas, he explained, had been born with a deformity. At first it was vague, a general frailty, a sensitivity to strong light that necessitated drawing curtains and keeping him indoors during sunny days. His appetite, too, from a very young age, was described as voracious, unusual, and difficult to satisfy. As Thomas grew, Silas documented the progression of this mysterious condition. The deformity wasn't just a general frailty. It became more specific, more pronounced. He described Thomas's hands, how they were different, elongated, and how Thomas would often try to hide them, clenching them into fists or burying them in his pockets. He wrote of Thomas's increasing isolation, his aversion to others, not out of shyness, but out of a growing discomfort and perhaps a fear of being seen. The family, Silas detailed, went to extraordinary lengths to conceal Thomas's condition from the public eye. Doctors were brought in secretly, their visits shrouded in secrecy, their diagnoses vague and unhelpful. Silas's entries became increasingly desperate, tinged with a profound sadness and fear. He detailed the family's sacrifices to meet Thomas's growing and increasingly peculiar needs. The insatiable hunger that had manifested in childhood became more extreme, less about conventional food and more about something else. Silas hinted at Thomas's growing aversion to sunlight, his preference for the deepest shadows, and a chilling transformation in his brother's demeanor. Thomas, once his playful twin, was becoming something else entirely, a shadow of his former self. Consumed by an unknown malady, the family's reclusiveness, previously attributed to their wealth and social standing, was now revealed to be a desperate measure to protect their secret. Silas wrote of their parents' increasing despair, their quiet anguish as they watched their son change, powerless to stop it. He detailed the intricate routines they developed to ensure Thomas's condition remained hidden, the constant vigilance, the fear of exposure. The weight of this secret, the burden of managing Thomas's increasingly demanding and unsettling needs, was clearly crushing the entire Thorne household. Silas's entries, once composed and reflective, grew more frantic, his penmanship becoming less steady, mirroring the escalating crisis within the Thorne family. The dark, unsettling history of the Thorne family, was no longer a matter of vague whispers. It was unfolding before David and Dr. Reed in the raw, agonizing words of a brother, forced to witness a horrifying transformation. The diary entries, once melancholic, now turned chillingly descriptive. Silas began to write of incidents, a euphemism for events that grew increasingly disturbing. At first, it was merely farm animals disappearing from the Thorne estate, a prized hen, then a lamb, then entire litters of piglets. The local farmers grumbled, attributing the losses to wild dogs or opportunistic coyotes, but Silas knew better. He saw the subtle changes in Thomas, the heightened alertness, the almost predatory gleam in his eyes after each disappearance. Then the incidents escalated. Pets from neighboring properties began to vanish. A beloved family dog from the farm down the road, a tabby cat from the village. The whispers in town grew louder, suspicion falling on vagrants or rival farmers, but never on the reclusive Thornes. Silas, however, bore the full weight of the truth. He wrote of his profound guilt, the agonizing knowledge that his brother was responsible, and the terrifying realization of what Thomas's hunger truly entailed. It was no longer about sustenance. It was about something darker, something that fed not merely on flesh, but on vitality, on life itself. Thomas's hunger intensified with terrifying speed. Silas noted how his brother grew visibly stronger, his movements more agile, his eyes more piercing immediately after these incidents. The vague frailty of his childhood had given way to a disturbing, almost unnatural vigor. He became increasingly nocturnal, venturing out only under the cloak of deepest night, returning with an unsettling satisfaction that sent shivers down Silas's spine. Silas's parents, once desperate to hide Thomas's condition, now seemed consumed by a profound, debilitating fear and despair. Their attempts to manage Thomas's escalating needs became more frantic, more desperate. They too became increasingly reclusive, their world shrinking to the confines of the estate, their lives revolving around protecting their monstrous secret. The once grand Thorne Manor became a prison, not just for Thomas, but for the entire family, trapped by the terrifying reality of their afflicted son. The pressure on Silas, as the only other healthy son, became immense. He was forced into the role of Thomas's primary caretaker, his confidant, and increasingly his unwitting accomplice. His diary entries detailed the agonizing struggle between his innate loyalty to his family and his own growing moral revulsion at Thomas's actions. He was caught in an impossible bind, tasked with protecting a brother who was rapidly transforming into a predator, and simultaneously protecting the family's ancient secret, which now threatened to consume them all. One entry, dated a few months before the photograph was taken, was particularly harrowing. Silas described a young servant girl named Sarah, barely 16, who had been hired from a nearby village. She was a bright, cheerful girl, full of life and laughter. One afternoon, Sarah had been alone in the west wing of the house dusting the portraits when Thomas, who had been confined to his room for days, managed to slip out. Silas, hearing a faint cry, had rushed to the wing, only to find an empty room, an overturned chair, and a single torn ribbon on the floor. Sarah was gone. He searched frantically, calling her name, but there was no trace. Later that night, Thomas returned to his room, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling contentment, a faint, almost metallic smell clinging to his clothes. Silas's guilt and horror were palpable in the writing, his hand shaking as he committed the unspeakable to paper. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what had happened to Sarah, and he knew he was powerless to stop it. The photograph, the very object that had drawn David and Dr. Reed into this dark history, was taken around this time. Silas's diary revealed the true context behind the seemingly ordinary portrait. It was a desperate, almost pathetic attempt by Silas to reclaim a semblance of normalcy, to create a tangible memory of his brother as he once was, before the true horror fully took hold. He had to force Thomas to pose, to endure the bright flash of the camera. Thomas, always averse to strong light, was visibly uncomfortable, his body stiff, his eyes narrowed. He made repeated, almost frantic attempts to hide his hands, clenching them into fists, tucking them behind his back, or burying them deep within the pockets of his coat. It was a struggle to get him to hold still, and even then, in the final captured image, the unnatural elongation of one hand was still subtly visible, a terrifying testament to his affliction, despite Thomas's best efforts to conceal it. The conflict within Silas escalated almost daily. His love for his brother warred with his growing terror and disgust. He was living a nightmare, trapped between familial duty and the horrifying reality of what Thomas had become. He wrestled with the moral implications of his silence, the knowledge that his brother was a danger, a predator preying on the innocent. The once clear lines between right and wrong blurred, replaced by a suffocating fog of fear, guilt, and an unbearable sense of responsibility. He began to question everything he knew, everything he believed. The protection of the family secret, once a sacred duty, now felt like a complicity in unspeakable acts. The Thorne estate, once a haven, had become a cage, and Silas, along with his parents, were prisoners within its walls, watching their world unravel, powerless to stop the encroaching darkness that was his own brother. Silas's diary entries revealed a chilling escalation, marking the undeniable breaking point. Thomas's condition, once a hidden family secret, spiraled into something uncontrollable, something monstrous. The physical changes Silas had hinted at in earlier entries became starkly detailed, transforming from vague afflictions into terrifying realities. Thomas's teeth, Silas wrote with trembling hand, were growing sharper, more pronounced, no longer resembling human dentition. His eyes, once merely sensitive, now actively recoiled from even the dimmest light, taking on a predatory sheen in the shadows. His movements, once clumsy and awkward during daylight, became unnervingly fluid and swift under the cover of darkness. Most disturbingly, Silas observed a desperate, animalistic intelligence in his brother's gaze, a cunning that spoke of something far beyond mere human illness. The disappearances, once confined to animals and the occasional unfortunate servant, now reached a terrifying apex. A local boy, no older than 10, from a neighboring farm, vanished without a trace one moonless night. Unlike previous incidents, this time there were witnesses. Not concrete evidence, but terrified whispers of a shadowy figure, impossibly tall and gaunt, seen lurking near the Thorne estate's perimeter just before dawn. The boy's distraught parents, fueled by grief and the unsettling rumors that had long clung to the reclusive Thornes, refused to accept the official explanation of a runaway or a wild animal attack. The townspeople, their patience worn thin by years of unexplained occurrences, and the Thornes' secretive nature, began to stir. The whispers that had followed the family for generations, once dismissed as mere superstition, now hardened into outright suspicion. Accusations, veiled at first, then increasingly bold, began to circulate through the village. Farmers spoke of strange tracks in their fields that defied identification. Mothers clutched their children closer, and lanterns burned late into the night in homes that had once felt safe. The Thorne name, already synonymous with eccentricity, was now uttered with a palpable sense of dread and fear. The fragile veil of secrecy the family had meticulously maintained for generations was tearing apart, threatening to expose not just their scandal, but the horrifying truth of Thomas. Silas, reading the fear in his parents' eyes, hearing the growing unrest from the town, and witnessing Thomas's accelerating transformation, knew with a chilling certainty that he could no longer protect his brother. More importantly, he realized he could no longer protect the town from him. The monster that had once been his twin, his beloved brother, was now a clear and present danger to everyone, including himself and his parents. The weight of his complicity, the silent horror he had borne, became unbearable. The love for his brother, once an unbreakable bond, was now overshadowed by a profound, agonizing terror and a desperate need to stop the escalating nightmare. In a series of frantic, almost illegible diary entries, scrawled with a desperate urgency, Silas documented his terrible, agonizing decision. He knew, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that there was only one way to stop Thomas. Conventional means were useless. Thomas was no longer a human afflicted by illness. He was something else entirely, something primal and deadly. Silas understood that he and he alone bore the burden of ending this horror. He decided he must stop Thomas himself, a decision that tore at the very fabric of his soul. His plan, meticulously detailed amidst the frantic scrawl, was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the estate. He would lure Thomas into the old root cellar, a structure built deep into the earth, with thick stone walls and a heavy reinforced door. It was a place designed for long-term storage, cool and dark, almost hermetically sealed from the outside world. It was, Silas realized, the only place on the estate that could possibly contain what Thomas had become. He planned to entice Thomas into its depths, perhaps with the promise of fresh meat, or by exploiting his aversion to light. Once inside, Silas would seal him in forever. The final entry in this sequence was fragmented, almost a stream of consciousness, detailing the practicalities of his grim task. He wrote of gathering supplies, reinforcing the cellar door, and the internal struggle, the profound grief warring with his grim resolve. He spoke of the heavy stones he would need to block the entrance, the mortar he would mix, the final, irreversible act. The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, a chilling testament to the urgency of his situation. The ink smeared, the words trailing off into an illegible scrawl, suggesting he was interrupted, or that the time for writing had passed and the time for action had arrived. The silence that followed in the diary, the sudden cessation of Silas's tormented words, spoke volumes of the terrible deed he was about to undertake, a desperate act of love and sacrifice born of the darkest necessity. David and Dr. Reed, their faces grim, closed the diary, the abrupt end of Silas's final entry hanging heavy in the dusty air of the hidden study. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspeakable horror and the chilling realization of Silas's desperate plan. They knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that the story was far from over. The question now wasn't what Silas intended to do, but what he actually did, and whether he succeeded. Driven by a renewed sense of urgency, they began to meticulously search the study again, their eyes now trained for anything Silas might have left behind to guide them. It was Dr. Reed, with her historian's keen eye for anomalies, who noticed a subtle discoloration on a section of the wall behind a heavy built-in bookshelf. It wasn't obvious, just a slight variation in the aged wood, almost imperceptible. With a combined effort, they managed to slide the bookshelf aside, revealing another, much older hidden compartment. This one was crafted from rough-hewn timber, clearly predating the elegant paneling of the main study, suggesting it had been part of the original structure of the house. Inside, nestled amongst decaying scrolls and brittle parchment, they found a single crudely drawn map of the Thorne estate. It was not a professional survey, but a simple hand-drawn sketch, likely made by Silas himself, or perhaps an even earlier ancestor. The map, though faded, clearly marked the location of the main house, the outbuildings, and with a thick, ominous X, the root cellar. Beside the map, lying on a bed of dried leaves, was a small, rusted, ancient key. Its design was intricate, hinting at an age far older than Silas's time, yet it felt strangely purposeful, as if waiting for its moment to be rediscovered. But the most significant discovery within this hidden compartment was a small, leather-bound book, distinct from Silas's personal diary. Its cover was unadorned, the leather worn smooth with age, and its pages were filled with elegant, almost calligraphic script. It was a collection of local legends and superstitions, meticulously compiled by an earlier Thorne ancestor, judging by the archaic language and the style of the illustrations. This was no ordinary book of folklore. It was a family chronicle of the unusual, a compendium of the strange phenomena that had plagued the region for generations, meticulously documented by those who bore witness. As Dr. Reed carefully turned the brittle pages, a particular entry caught her eye. It described a creature, a shadow eater, a being of profound darkness and insatiable hunger that preyed on the life force of others. The text spoke of its insidious nature, how it began as a whisper, a subtle drain, and then grew, feasting on vitality, growing stronger with each victim it claimed. The descriptions were chillingly precise: an aversion to light, an unnatural elongation of limbs, particularly the hands, and a cunning intelligence that belied its monstrous form. The legend explicitly stated that the Shadow Eater could only be truly contained, never killed, by severing its connection to the outside world. The most effective methods, passed down through generations of whispered lore, involved being buried alive or sealed away in absolute, perpetual darkness, a fate that echoed Silas's desperate plan for Thomas. A cold dread spread through David as he listened to Dr. Reed read. The description of the Shadow Eater perfectly matched the terrifying progression of Thomas's condition, as detailed in Silas's diary. Every strange symptom, every monstrous transformation, every act of predation aligned with the ancient legend. This wasn't merely a family curse or a genetic affliction. It was something far older, far more sinister, a creature of folklore made horrifyingly real within the Thorn lineage. David and Dr. Reed exchanged a look of grim understanding. Silas hadn't simply contained Thomas out of a desperate last-minute decision. He had performed a gruesome, yet calculated act of justice, a terrible duty passed down through generations, informed by generations-old family knowledge of how to deal with such an unspeakable horror. The rusted key and the map now held a new, terrifying significance. They weren't just clues. They were an invitation to confront the past, to witness the legacy of Silas's agonizing choice. Without another word, they gathered the map and the key. The air in the study, once merely dusty, now felt charged with a palpable sense of historical gravity and impending revelation. They knew where they had to go. The root cellar, marked so ominously on the ancient map, was not just a storage space. It was a tomb, a prison, and a testament to the ultimate sacrifice. They made their way out of the main house, the silence of the abandoned manor amplifying their footsteps. The grounds were overgrown, the paths swallowed by weeds and thorny bushes. Following the crude map, they navigated the dense undergrowth, past crumbling outbuildings, and what looked like the skeletal remains of an old greenhouse. Finally, hidden behind a thicket of gnarled trees and almost completely swallowed by creeping vines, they found it. A collapsed shed, its timber rotted and caved in, sat atop a small, almost imperceptible mound in the earth. Beneath the debris, partially obscured by decades of neglect, was a low, stone-lined entrance, exactly where the map indicated. It was sealed with heavy, rough-hewn stones, mortared together with a dark, almost black substance that looked as ancient as the earth itself. It was evident that tremendous effort had gone into sealing this place, a desperate final act to contain the horror within. The rusted key in David's hand felt impossibly heavy, a tangible link to a terrible past. They stood before it, the weight of history and the chilling implications of their discovery pressing down on them. The truth of the photograph, of the two brothers, was about to be fully revealed. David and Dr. Reed, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and grim determination, now stood before the sealed entrance to the root cellar. The heavy stones, cemented with ancient, darkened mortar, seemed to mock their efforts, a silent testament to the Herculean task Silas Thorn had undertaken a century and a half ago. The rusted key, clutched in David's hand, felt like a relic from another, darker time, a tangible connection to the horror that lay entombed beneath their feet. They knew they couldn't simply unlock it. The entrance had been deliberately, meticulously sealed from the outside, an act of containment rather than mere closure. David, using a sturdy crowbar he'd retrieved from the abandoned shed, began to carefully pry at the mortar between the stones. Dr. Reed, ever the historian, watched intently, ensuring he didn't damage any structural elements that might hold further clues. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood, a scent that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten time. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only an hour of strenuous effort, David managed to dislodge a few of the smaller stones, creating a narrow gap, just enough to peer into the oppressive darkness beyond. It was a small, irregular opening, barely wide enough to admit a human head, but it was enough. The air that seeped out from the newly created aperture was not merely stale, it was thick and cold, carrying a faint, unsettling odor that was difficult to place. It wasn't the smell of decay in the traditional sense, but something more primal, metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with dust and something utterly alien. It sent an involuntary shiver down David's spine, a primal warning that whatever lay within had been undisturbed for a very, very long time. Dr. Reed, always prepared, produced a powerful LED flashlight from her bag. Its beam, cutting through the absolute suffocating darkness, was a stark intrusion into a realm that had known no light for decades. The light danced across the small enclosed space, revealing the rough-hewn stone walls of the cellar, still solid and unforgiving. The floor was earthen, covered in a fine layer of disturbed dust, as if something had moved there long ago. And then, the beam settled. In the very center of the small room, slumped against the far wall, was something skeletal. It was covered in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs, making its form indistinct at first. But as the light intensified, the horrifying details emerged. It was undeniably a human skeleton, or what remained of one, collapsed in a posture of final, desperate repose. But its hands. The skeletal hands were the first thing that truly registered, even before the full horror of the scene could take hold. They were unnaturally long and thin, the finger bones grotesquely extended and bent at sharp, impossible angles, almost like the talons of some predatory bird. They were precisely like the unnatural hand in the photograph. The chilling detail that had first drawn them into this mystery was now laid bare before them, a skeletal testament to the unspeakable truth. There was no doubt. This was Thomas. Next to the skeleton, partially obscured by a fallen stone and a tangle of cobwebs, lay a small, rusted metal box. It was a simple, rectangular container, the kind used for storing documents or small valuables. But its presence here, beside the remains of Thomas Thorne, felt profoundly significant. Carefully, meticulously, David worked to widen the opening just enough to reach in, his arm extended, his fingers brushing against the cold, gritty earth before they closed around the rusted box. He pulled it out, bringing it into the dim daylight. It was surprisingly heavy, and its surface was cold to the touch, despite the warmth of the sun outside. Dr. Reed, her hands trembling slightly, helped him pry open the rusted lid. Inside, nestled amongst a few brittle, desiccated leaves, was a single folded piece of parchment. It was old, yellowed with age, and its edges were fragile, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. It was a final, faded note, written in a hand that was unmistakably Silas Thorne's. Dr. Reed carefully unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the elegant yet slightly shaky script. She began to read aloud, her voice hushed, lending a solemn gravity to Silas's final words. "To whomsoever finds this, if such a day should ever come, know that I bear the weight of a terrible truth and an even more terrible deed. I sealed him here, my brother Thomas, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, agonizing necessity. The monster he became was not the brother I knew, the twin I loved. The Shadow Eater, as our family lore names it, had consumed him utterly. There was no cure, no redemption, only containment." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, the air from the cellar still clinging to them. "I write this with a heart broken beyond repair, yet firm in the conviction that it was the only way to protect the innocent, to spare this town from a fate too ghastly to contemplate. Let my guilt be my eternal burden, but let the lives saved be my only solace. I beg of you, for the love of God, do not unleash this horror again. Let him remain entombed, a forgotten tragedy, lest the darkness he embodied consume us all." The note continued, offering a chilling glimpse into the Thorne family's long, tortured history. "This affliction, as it was euphemistically called, has haunted our lineage for generations. A dark secret passed down through whispers and veiled warnings. We, the Thornes, were not merely cursed. We were made guardians of a terrible truth, burdened with the responsibility of containing the manifestations of this ancient evil when they arose within our own blood. Each generation faced its own horrors, its own sacrifices. My parents, their own lives consumed by the effort to manage Thomas, understood the grim duty I inherited. They understood the final act I had to commit. This knowledge, this burden, was our legacy, a silent, unseen war waged within the walls of this estate. The note ended with a plea, a final poignant whisper from the past. I ask for forgiveness, from God, from Thomas, and from any who might judge my actions. But most of all, I ask for Thomas to be remembered only as my brother, the kind soul who once laughed and lived, not the monster he was forced to become. Let his memory be of the boy in the photograph, not the creature sealed in this tomb. Dr. Reed finished reading, her voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of Silas's grief, his sacrifice, and the chilling confirmation of everything they had suspected. The photograph, once a curious anomaly, was now a tragic monument to an unspeakable family secret, a desperate attempt to capture a fleeting moment of normalcy before the darkness consumed everything. The truth was laid bare, horrifying and utterly complete. David and Dr. Reed stood in the spectral silence of the old Thorne estate, the faded parchment from Silas Thorne clutched in Dr. Reed's hand. The finality of Silas's words, his profound grief interwoven with an unshakable resolve, echoed in the stillness. They had unearthed a truth far more disturbing than any historical anomaly or genetic peculiarity they had initially imagined. They had stumbled upon a legacy of horror, a monstrous secret of an ancient evil that had clung to the Thorne lineage like a parasitic shadow. The skeletal remains of Thomas, with his unnaturally elongated fingers, were not just a victim of a rare disease, but the tragic manifestation of a shadow eater, a creature of folklore made terrifyingly real. The weight of this revelation pressed down on them, a chilling understanding that transcended their academic curiosity. They had witnessed the ultimate sacrifice, the agonizing choice of a brother who had to become a jailer, a protector, an executioner. The implications were staggering, not just for the Thorne family, but for their own understanding of history and the thin veil between myth and reality. A difficult decision loomed before them. Silas's plea, etched onto the brittle paper, was clear. Do not unleash this horror again. Let him remain entombed, a forgotten tragedy. The responsibility of this knowledge, this terrible secret, now rested squarely on their shoulders. They could expose it, reveal the true, monstrous nature of Thomas Thorne to the world, and perhaps even risk disturbing the ancient evil that Silas had so painstakingly contained. Or they could honor Silas's desperate wish, preserving the fragile peace bought with such immense suffering. After a long, silent moment, their eyes met. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared recognition of the gravity of the situation. Dr. Reed, the historian, the academic, saw not just a scientific discovery, but a human tragedy of epic proportions. David, the enthusiast, the seeker of truth, felt the profound moral obligation to respect the desperate act of a man driven to the edge of sanity to protect his world. They decided to respect Silas's final wish. The larger, monstrous truth would remain contained, buried beneath the earth, just as Thomas had been. With heavy hearts and a sense of solemn duty, they began the painstaking process of resealing the root cellar. David, using the same crowbar that had helped them gain entry, carefully replaced the dislodged stones. Dr. Reed, with meticulous precision, mixed a fresh batch of mortar, carefully applying it to the cracks and crevices, ensuring that the seal was as strong, as absolute, as the one Silas had created over a century ago. It was a symbolic act, a quiet reaffirmation of the containment, a promise to the past and a safeguard for the future. They left Thomas's remains undisturbed, a permanent silent guardian of his dark secret, his skeletal fingers forever reaching, forever contained. The root cellar, once a portal to a horrifying past, was once again a tomb, a silent monument to a forgotten tragedy. Their work, however, was not entirely done. They were historians, and the Thorne family's story, albeit sanitized, deserved to be told. They published an article in a respected historical journal, carefully crafting the narrative to hint at the truth without fully revealing the supernatural horror. The article focused on the Thorne family's reclusive nature, their immense wealth, and the peculiar affliction that had plagued their lineage for generations. They described it as a rare, debilitating genetic condition, one that caused severe physical deformities and intense social isolation, often leading to tragic outcomes. They spoke of Silas Thorne's devotion to his ailing brother, Thomas, and the family's desperate attempts to shield him from the judgmental eyes of society. The narrative was poignant, tragic, and entirely plausible, allowing an academic audience to ponder the psychological and social impacts of such a condition, without ever touching upon the supernatural entity that truly lay beneath. The original photograph, the tintype that had started their extraordinary journey, was donated to the local historical society in Salem. It was framed and displayed with a carefully worded caption. It identified the two young men as Silas and Thomas Thorne, noting their connection to the prominent, yet reclusive, Salem family. The caption discreetly mentioned the unusual physical characteristics of one brother, leaving the deeper, more unsettling horror to the imagination of those who might look closely, just as Dr. Reed had. It became a silent conversation starter, a subtle nod to a mystery that would never be fully unraveled by the public eye. David and Dr. Reed continued their separate lives, but their shared experience had forged an unbreakable bond between them. They were left with the chilling knowledge of what truly lay beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary history, forever changed by the photograph of two brothers and the terrifying secret held in their hands. The world, for them, was no longer just a collection of facts and figures. It was a tapestry, woven with threads of myth and reality, where ancient evils could manifest in the most unexpected and heartbreaking ways. They carried the burden of their knowledge with a quiet solemnity, understanding that some truths were too dangerous, too devastating to be fully unleashed. Sometimes David would find himself staring at the framed photograph on his desk, a high-quality reproduction of the original. He would trace the outline of Thomas's unnaturally long fingers, a phantom chill running through him. He often wondered if anyone else looking at the photo ever felt the same cold dread, the same unsettling intuition that there was more to the story than met the eye. Dr. Reed, in her lectures, would occasionally reference the Thorne family, using them as an example of how historical narratives can be shaped by societal pressures, by fear, and by the desperate need for secrecy. But in her private thoughts, she knew the real reason for their reclusiveness, the true nature of their burden. She knew that some legends were not just stories, but warnings, echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. The old Thorne estate, now officially recognized as a site of historical significance, remained abandoned, its secrets intact. The town gossiped about its reclusive former owners, about the strange occurrences and the lingering sense of unease that permeated the grounds. But no one ever truly knew the full extent of the horror that had unfolded within its walls, or the silent, skeletal guardian that still lay entombed beneath the collapsed shed. The root cellar, long forgotten by all but two living souls, remained a silent testament, a hidden tomb where a brother's love and a desperate sacrifice had sealed away an ancient evil. The wind would whistle through the broken windows of the mansion, carrying whispers of a past that refused to die, a chilling reminder that some secrets, once unearthed, can never truly be forgotten, even if they are never fully told.